category that Milton brooded on and cultivated his entire writing life. From a very early age, Milton nursed the image of himself as a powerful poet. And in Milton, we have a man who was able to state, now just think about this for a moment, I take this to be an absolutely remarkable fact. We have in Milton a man who was able to state categorically in his early 20s, so just a few years older than you are now, that the epic poem that he would not even begin writing for another 25 years would become an unforgettable work of English literature. Milton anticipated and lovingly invested all of his energy in his future literary power and his future literary fame. He anticipated this power much as his father, the reasonably well-to-do banker, might have anticipated long-term earnings from a particularly risky business venture. And in Milton's case, this investment in power paid off. Milton would eventually come to feel so comfortable with the mantle of power that he was able to do much more than simply rewrite the first books of the Bible, which is, of course, one of the things that he accomplished in Paradise Lost, and that is itself no mean undertaking. By the end of his life, though, Milton would, in effect, try to rewrite everything. After he published all of his major poems, he began publishing a spate of works that attempted to recreate British culture from the ground up. He invented his own system of philosophical logic. He published a treatise that he had written earlier on grammar, inventing his own system for the understanding and the learning of the Latin language. He wrote a long and detailed history of Britain, attempting to create the meaning of that little island that he always assumed was God's chosen nation. And finally, and probably for Milton most important, Milton wrote a theology, inventing, in effect, his own religion. And Milton's Protestantism looks like no one else's, since before or since. There's a real sense, I think, in which Milton wanted to recreate all of Western culture, or to recreate all of Western culture in his own image. And regardless of what we think of the success of that example, or of the appeal of the attempt to do such a thing, the amazing thing, I think, is that Milton felt so empowered even to embark on such an enormous project. And readers of Milton ever since have had to confront not just Milton's writing, but this unspeakable sense of empowerment that underlies just about everything that Milton writes. And so it seems to me that a useful introduction to the poetry of Milton would be a look at some of the various types of power that Milton imagines in his work, and some of the types of power that literary history has tended to confer upon Milton the man, the image of Milton the man, and Milton's writing. Now, probably the form of power that we most readily associate with John Milton involves his position at the dead center of the English literary canon. Milton is, this goes beyond questioning. He's an object of worship by British and American institutions of higher education. And my guess is that many of you have failed, that few of you have failed to observe that it's practically impossible to graduate from Yale with a Bachelor of Arts in English without having read Paradise Lost, either English 125 or DS Lit, or in fact, in a course just like this one. This, for you, some of this will be, this is the course. And you, those of you who are taking this course because you have to take one of the pre-1800s, and Milton is one of those, you are more than entitled to ask why this poet Milton is exercising this institutional sway over you as you go about choosing your courses, or perhaps you experience your courses in some way as having been chosen for you. It would be utterly inadequate for us to account for this institutional, and it's a real institutional power that Milton holds over us, by stating blandly that Milton is the greatest English poet. That's the easy answer, obviously, and of course it's not untrue. But we can do better than that. And we can anatomize some of the forms of power that have been most commonly attributed to this greatest English poet. There's first the understandable aesthetic power, the power of the beauty of Milton's verse, an aesthetic power that's often thought or felt to inhere somewhere in the poetry itself. And in fact, for readers of Paradise Lost, and this has been an experience now for a few hundred years, it does often seem as if there were some mysterious life force pulsating through Milton's dense and driving lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter in Paradise Lost. Now, there's also the power that Milton himself claimed was behind the poetry of Paradise Lost. Milton insisted, and it's completely possible that he might actually have believed, that God himself was responsible for composing the poetry of Paradise Lost, that John Milton was merely the conduit for God's first serious attempt at an epic poem. And so we have, in this perspective, we have an image of the awesome power of the deity himself, thundering away behind every jot and tittle of Milton's great epic. But for Milton's contemporaries in the 17th century, Milton's power really wasn't at all aesthetic or even religious in nature. Milton's power was primarily seen as social and political and cultural. Milton, and this is a wildly anachronistic use of terms, but there's nonetheless a lot of sense to it. Milton was essentially a left-wing political radical. And it was widely feared by his more timid contemporaries that his writings would seduce his readers into rejecting good old-fashioned traditional religious and social values. And there's a lot of validity to that contemporary cultural fear. Milton was a revolutionary. He was responsible for writing the first justification for an armed rebellion against a legitimate monarch, the first to publish such a work essentially in all of Europe. Milton actually wrote that it was the duty, not just the right, but the duty of a nation to rise up and dethrone through execution, an unjust and though legitimate king. And Milton, in fact, was largely responsible in a cultural sense for the fact that the armed rebellion of England's Civil War, what we think of as the Puritan Revolution, actually led to the execution by decapitation of England's monarch Charles I in 1649. And on top of all of this political revolution, the political radicalism, Milton was one of the first intellectuals in Europe to speak out in favor not only of divorce. Milton argued for the right to divorce on grounds of incompatibility, but also he argued in favor of the right to plural marriage, polygamy. He was branded as a radical and dangerous debunker of traditional Christian family values. Now, many of you know that Milton, in his later years, was blind. And the fact of his blindness was, in his own day, frequently cited by contemporary preachers, men at the pulpit, as an example of exactly how God punishes those who dare to write against the king, or those who dare to write against the institution of marriage or the family. And Milton's power for so many of these contemporaries was seen as palpably destructive and truly frightening. Obviously, it goes without saying that today, the assessment of Milton as some kind of imminent social threat, or some sort of social force, in terms of his the radical nature of political power, that has taken a sharp turn. Milton is much more likely imagined to wield, and if you have any sense of what the mythology surrounding Milton is, you would have to agree with this. Milton's much more likely to be imagined to wield a socially conservative power over his readers. In the debates ranging for the last 30 years or so over the value of traditional pedagogy and over the value of canonical reading lists, Milton is always cited invariably cited as the canon's most stalwart representative of oppressive religious and social values. And there's no question, Milton is the dead white male poet par excellence, in English letters certainly. And his poetry works, at least from this point of view, his poetry works to solidify those dead white male values, whatever those are, in the unsuspecting minds of his readers, none of whom obviously are dead, and many of whom are neither white nor male. Milton's power, from this perspective of the radical cultural critique, is really not so different from the power of the late Jerry Falwell, or someone like Rush Limbaugh. There's something insidious and culturally malicious and powerful about the social conservatism of what is thought to be his voice. Now, this is a contemporary picture of John Milton, and this more or less contemporary picture of Milton as a powerful force of conservatism derives in large part from the English writer Virginia Woolf, who wrote for a few decades, but wrote about Milton during the 1920s. And it's Woolf's image that's probably the one that's most firmly rooted in the minds of Milton's readers today. For Virginia Woolf, especially in A Room of One's Own, the dead writer Milton exercises an active power at the present moment as he forces his female readers to accept their subordinate place in society. And the text of Milton, and especially of Paradise Lost, therefore has to be seen as an active, persistently malignant conveyor of patriarchal oppression. Now, like all judgments of literary value,